After midnight, rules change. Schedules loosen, guards drop, and conversations drift into places daylight never allows. That's why, in Hollywood, the hours after midnight carry a quiet weight, especially when people refuse to talk about what happened during them. For years, there has been one night no one could quite place on a timeline. No leaked photos, no witness accounts, no dramatic fallout the next morning. Just a noticeable shift that followed quietly, as if something essential had been decided while the world was asleep. The night involved Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson, but not in the way rumors usually suggest. There was no public after-party, no chaotic scene, no headline-ready moment. What made the night unsettling was not what surfaced afterward, but what never did. Insiders describe the setting as controlled and intentionally private. Not a hotel lobby, not a crowded gathering, but a place chosen precisely because nothing from it would escape. Both believed that whatever happened there would remain contained, unrecorded, and unrepeatable. What followed that night wasn't scandal, it was restraint. In the weeks after, those close to them noticed a subtle recalibration. Conversations shortened, boundaries sharpened, familiar ease gave way to a careful distance that hadn't existed before. Nothing explosive occurred to justify that change, and that's exactly why it drew attention. Hollywood is used to damage control after visible mistakes. This felt different. It felt like the aftermath of a decision rather than an accident. The most telling sign was what happened in interviews. Questions that brushed anywhere near that time period were deflected with identical phrasing. Answers were neutral, practiced, and noticeably incomplete. Not evasive, but unfinished, like pages torn from a book everyone agreed not to reference. Industry veterans recognized the pattern immediately. When two people share an experience they don't want reinterpreted publicly, silence becomes coordinated. Not scripted, not enforced, just understood. That silence settled in quickly and stayed. Fans, of course, sensed something without knowing why. The chemistry didn't disappear, but it changed shape. What once felt spontaneous became measured. What felt unguarded now came with pauses that lingered just long enough to register. According to those familiar with the night, the significance wasn't in any physical line being crossed. It was in something spoken out loud that could never be unheard. After midnight, conversations lose their filters, and truths that feel manageable in daylight suddenly carry consequences. That realization, whatever it was, didn't demand immediate action. It demanded adjustment. Both seemed to understand that the moment couldn't be reversed, only managed. And management, in this case, meant never letting the night define them publicly. What made the silence effective was mutual discipline. No one slipped, no careless comment escaped. Years passed without contradiction, which only deepened curiosity. If nothing happened, people wondered, why was nothing ever clarified? The answer seemed to lie in how carefully both avoided framing the night as anything at all. Not good, not bad, just unspoken. In Hollywood, that usually means something mattered too much to risk simplification. Observers noted that after that night, opportunities to lean into nostalgia were consistently declined. No playful callbacks, no shared anecdotes, no invitations to reinterpret the past. The boundary wasn't hostile, it was firm. The night itself faded into myth, not because it was dramatic, but because it was decisive. It marked a point after which things could continue, but never quite return to how they were. That kind of shift doesn't need witnesses to be real. Years later, when asked why the night was never discussed, one insider summed it up quietly. Because talking about it would change what it meant. In Hollywood, meaning is often more dangerous than fact. If nothing happened after midnight, everything would have stayed the same. Instead, everything adjusted just enough to suggest that something important had been understood, and carefully carried forward in silence. And that silence, more than any rumor, is why people kept asking what really happened after midnight. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was quieter than anyone expected. There was no dramatic confession, no attempt to reframe the past as scandal or romance. What happened after midnight was a conversation, one that redefined everything without changing anything on the surface. According to people familiar with that night, Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson reached a moment of clarity neither had anticipated. It wasn't about crossing a physical boundary. It was about acknowledging an emotional one that had existed unspoken for far too long. After midnight, when exhaustion lowers defenses, honesty becomes harder to control. Words come out without strategy, stripped of future planning. What was said that night wasn't reckless, it was precise. A recognition of something real, and equally important, a recognition of what could never happen because of it. That distinction mattered. It transformed a lingering ambiguity into a conscious boundary. Once named, it couldn't be ignored or romanticized. The connection didn't disappear, but it was no longer undefined. This is why silence followed. Not because the truth was shameful, but because speaking it publicly would have flattened its meaning. Once something complex is reduced to a headline, it loses its power to guide behavior. Silence allowed the understanding to remain intact. The aftermath looked uneventful to outsiders. No fallout, no distancing that demanded explanation. But internally, everything had shifted. Decisions became more intentional. Interactions carried weight they hadn't before. What had once felt instinctive now required awareness. Years passed, and the night remained untouched by public narrative. That wasn't avoidance unity of omission, it was discipline. Both understood that revealing the truth too soon would invite misinterpretation, and misinterpretation would force them into roles they had already decided not to play. The reason they chose to finally speak now wasn't pressure from fans or curiosity from the press. It was context. Time had softened the edges. The understanding forged after midnight had already done its work. The consequences were no longer active, they were complete. What they shared wasn't the content of the conversation, but its effect. They spoke about boundaries, respect, and the importance of naming things before they grow dangerous. They framed the night not as a turning point of drama, but as a moment of responsibility. Fans searching for spectacle were left disoriented. The shock wasn't in what was revealed. It was in how ordinary and human it was. Two people realizing that clarity, even when uncomfortable, is safer than ambiguity left unchecked. Industry insiders weren't surprised. They had seen the adjustments years ago. The controlled distance. The refusal to exploit nostalgia. The consistency that followed the night like a quiet promise kept. In hindsight, the midnight conversation explained everything that came after. Why certain opportunities were declined. Why the dynamic changed without explanation. Why the silence endured so completely. It wasn't avoidance, it was adherence to a decision made in full awareness. What really happened after midnight wasn't a secret waiting to explode. It was a choice made once and honored continuously. That kind of discipline rarely produces headlines, but it reshapes lives. Some nights don't end relationships. They define them. And sometimes, telling the truth isn't about revealing what happened. It's about explaining why nothing else ever did.